to look at C.S. Lewis's work, The Discarded Image.
Is the screen down too low? Is that why it's black on the
I have absolutely no idea. I have not done anything, and I can't fix it.
Okay.
But this is the work we're looking at, Introduction to Medieval and Renaissance Literature. I'm taking this as an example of Lewis's lit theory, or literary criticism, and overlooking a great deal of other works we could look at. And the reason I do this particular one is it's about the last one he wrote, and it is very helpful by way of an introduction to his work in general. It also helps us when we come to read Narnia, and it will also help us with his science fiction trilogy, which we'll deal with next semester if you're with me for the sci-fi subcreation course. But I said, as far as this course goes, I wanted to, it's a course on C.S. Lewis, I wanted to give something of the various enterprises he was involved with as a writer, and fiction's only one of them, although it's the one that most people know. It's not the one that I myself first encountered. I encountered him first as a scholar writing as a medievalist, and grew to appreciate him through that. So I read The Allegory of Love, which is studying the romance of the rose and that theme there. And in The Allegory of Love, he claimed that the idea of romantic love as we currently conceive it is a medieval invention, which is an interesting thesis, and I don't think it's correct. However, there's some basis for what he's saying. I actually think that the modern contemporary basis of romantic love probably owes at least as much to the Puritans who followed that as to the medievalists. In the medieval idea, romantic love is adulterous. And I don't think we associate romantic love with adultery the way a medieval would. So if it originates there, which is maybe his claim, I guess we could give him some credence. But again, I would say that we probably find evidence of it in Song of Songs, among other things. There's certainly praise of romantic love there in the language itself. We're going to look at the discarded image for reasons I just said. And I said because we lost a class, the first lecture I'm going to just direct you to a pre-recorded lecture. I'll just stick it up on the course website. This one will focus on the middle chapters. So today I'm going to look at the heavens, which is chapter 5 of this work, and chapter 6, called the longevi, those who live long lives. those two things. And then next class, we'll look at the rest of the book, chapters 8 and following, or 7 and following. But I wanted to focus on this, and as I say, as an example of literary criticism, because it seems to me that Lewis is a superb literary scholar, and he has a way of approaching literary scholarship which I wanted to attend to, in part because of what he said in The Abolition of Man about education. So when he is writing as a scholar, how does he do things differently? Remember, he said that the modern educator says, do as I say, not do as I do. He is like a modern educator is like the turkey farmer dealing with a turkey, rather than an older bird teaching a young bird to fly. How does Lewis approach the field of literary criticism then? Well, it seems to me, and this is a critic that says this, by the name of Walsh, he says that Lewis is singularly free from packaged judgments and is always able to respond to a book as though he were reading it for the first time. he is happier to find a few lines to praise than to cast a whole book into outer darkness. And he's the type of scholar least in fashion, the appreciative critic, whose great gift is to whet a reader's appetite and to give him just enough practical guidance so that he can find his way. So he's there to show us rather than tell us to some degree. And he is, as an appreciative reader, teaching us to appreciate what he appreciates. And so I think it might have been Lewis that said this. I've certainly taken it as a motto. I think I got it from Lewis. I try not to teach things that I don't like, because I don't think I'm a fair person to teach it then. Studying literature should help us appreciate it. And if I can't stand it, then I'm not the best person to help you appreciate it. Because I'm not seeing the beauties there. Maybe I'm just missing them. In any rate, my distaste for the subject is going to color my presentation of it. And I don't think I'm doing what I ought to do, because literature is really about delight. That's an important part of teaching literature. It is to teach, of course, but it's also to delight. And he tries to get out of the way of the reader. And this is from Donald Williams. He comments, Lewis sees himself as the servant of the reader, and for the sake of the reader, as the servant of the author. He wants to introduce us to his friends, to bring us together, and then let our relationship with those authors grow naturally, unencumbered either by ignorance or by tendentious literary theory. And I found that myself. So when I read Lewis, I suddenly felt I was better able to understand what I was reading from the medieval or the Renaissance period, whatever. And we could talk about this work. Well, we are going to talk about The Discarded Image, but we could also talk about Preface to Paradise Lost, which does exactly the same thing. You read that. I almost never say to a student, read this critic and then read the work. But I can do that very happily with Lewis, because he is giving you background information to help you read the work in the same way I try to do in my own classes. I'm there to help you to read it, not to tell you what's there, although I am also commenting on it and giving you my opinion, and to some degree giving a Christian analysis of it, which doesn't mean that just because I say it is the only Christian take on it, but it's this Christian's take on it. And I try and give reasons why it might be more generally so. But he does this in The Allegory of Love. He also does it in English literature in the 16th century, which is his biggest critical work. It's 600 odd pages. And I mention that work because it's quite important. It's the one that has stood the test of time in the literary establishment, in part because it's magnificently written. That's part of it. And most scholars can't write worth a hill of beans. It's terrible. It's impenetrable. They use jargon. It seems like they're trying to parade their knowledge or confuse the reader. And if they're not trying to do that, then that's the effect of what they're doing, so that they're not even really able to do what they're trying to do. And probably they're just writing for a small subset of people like themselves then, and not for others to read it then, in which case I'm not sure what the enormous value is there. So his Lewis, I find, is a tonic for the reader, help us to be stronger in appreciation. And one of the things that really struck me, and you might find this interesting as well, when I read that work I just spoke of, the English literature in the 16th century, is he talks about magic there. And he says, and this is going to become relevant because we're going to talk about, in the discussion of the longevity, he's going to talk about fairy. And when we think of fairies, we think of magic. And we think of magic, we think of witchcraft, etc., this sort of thing. Or something that would be forbidden in Scripture, for instance. right? And we will further tend to associate that with the medieval period and think of the Renaissance as the beginning of a sort of enlightenment, and with the word Renaissance, a return to the classical sources, a dispensing of the sort of medieval theologizing and mystification of the church. And so you're getting back to the way things ought to be seen. And the medieval period is presented as the Dark Ages then, right? That's the standard take that's been there since the Enlightenment. And Lewis, interestingly, tends to think that the divide between the medieval and the Renaissance period is basically false. He doesn't think that there is a hard divide there. He sees a continuation of the medieval sensibilities. And the Renaissance, and again, some people disagree with him here, and the Renaissance is largely a revival of interest in the core texts of the ancient world, yes, but it's not out of touch with the medieval period. And it's certainly not anti-Christian, as it's sometimes presented by the Enlightenment. So the Enlightenment sees its beginnings in the Renaissance, and he says that's just simply not. So there is basically almost nobody in the 16th century in England who calls himself a humanist, who is also probably not a Puritan. I mean, they go alongside one another, although there are some people who are humanists who are Catholics, and Sir Thomas More is one of them. And that in itself is interesting, because More is the one who gives us the modern Latin or Greek New Testament, more or less. And because of his recovery of many of the a better Greek text, the Reformation to some degree is rooted in that. They reread the Latin Bible and see that it's at odds with the Greek sources and say, let's look at this a little further. He's unwitting in this. It's not intended to be a reform, but his work is necessary to that. So there is an interest in language and in grammar and in texts and reading them very carefully in the period. But the interest in magic is not one of the medieval period. He's very clear about this. He says that he sees very little sign of an interest in magic in the Middle Ages. In fact, he sees it as characteristic of modern science. What we call magic, which is a sort of power over nature, that's characteristic of modern science, and it is almost concurrent with it. So Macbeth, which is written in the time of King James, the Scottish king, when Elizabeth dies, was obsessed with witches, terrified that they would subvert his reign, etc. Modern science, if you want to date it to the Royal Society, has not yet begun, but there is a methodology, a way of thinking that's there in Francis Bacon already in this period, which shows that there's an attempt to gain intellectual power over nature. That's there, and along with that, magic is very much like that. That's what magic is characterized by, right? I can say this spell, and like Harry Potter, hocus pocus, boom, it happens, right? I won't dazzle you with my knowledge of Potter language and the faux Latin words that she uses. But that's more or less how magic works. You do some sort of incantation, you wave your wand, and then something happens that shows a great deal of power there. And that is what we associate with witchcraft. But that is what modern science does. And he says we don't really see that in the medieval period at all. So we'll come to that in a minute. I just find that alone was fascinating for me, because I always thought that the medieval period had a great deal of fear of witches and superstitions, and maybe it was a Protestant bias of mine, because we associate Protestants with the Salem witch trials and so forth, right, in Massachusetts, and James I. Is that because of their Protestantism, Or is it because of the general tenor of the mind towards the natural world that is in the period? And I think it's the latter. I think it's a view of nature where nature has become an instrument rather than a sacred order. And this is part of the sacred order. That's why this is on the screen. So we're first going to look, so that was a sort of an introduction, but this is why I want to present here. Now this is a cosmology. The chapter is called The Heavens. And what it is talking about is what is associated with the heavens, as well as talking about cosmology. It's talking about the things associated with that cosmology. And there are a lot of things associated with that cosmology. In fact, everything is associated with that cosmology. And therein lies the problem. Because when you overthrow a cosmology, it also subverts all of the things that were attached with it. If you see a continuity and an interconnection of all things with each other, then if you pull one away such that it is not just unimaginable, but literally irrational, untenable, then it seems like the whole system falls down with it. And that is, to some degree, how it was perceived. Now, online I have a lecture in which John Donne talks about this in a poem called The First Anniversary. And he says, a new philosophy casts all in doubt, the element of fire is quite put out. The sun and the earth are lost, and no man's wit knows where to look for it. When in the heavens, man can see so many new. There's a new heavens that they look at because everything's dissolved to its atoms. Whereas before, when they looked at the cosmos, they saw something perfect and beautiful and rational and orderly and interconnected to all things. The new cosmology throws everything out, the new philosophy, as he calls it. By the way, when he writes that poem, he's not referring to Descartes. Descartes writes in 1640. Donne's poem is in about 1610. He's talking about Galileo. He's probably talking about the way of looking at the cosmos, because he's explicitly commenting on cosmology, and then he goes on to talk about the effect on politics and domestic affairs, etc., etc. I won't go to that poem, but you can find the lecture online if you want. But this is the cosmology. Let me get to this here. So this is the medieval view of the cosmos behind me. It is called the Ptolemaic cosmology. Some of you will have heard me talk about this before. Doesn't hurt to hear it more than once. So this is the Ptolemaic cosmology, or if you want, you can call it the geocentric. And it will be replaced by the Copernican view. C-O-P helps we can spell, which is heliocentric. The name of Ptolemy, he was an Egyptian astronomer, wrote in Greek. Probably writing from Alexandria, which was, as the name suggests, founded by Alexander the Great. He left behind various things, including a great library, but also the Greek language and the culture that went with it in Egypt, and there's a great school and a great library there, etc. Ptolemy was an astronomer there, and he had a certain view of the heavens, which actually was very common to his forebears as well. And that was that the Earth was at the center of the cosmos, and the other planets revolved around it, including the sun. And it's sort of it's a highly rational, it's an empirical understanding of the cosmos, or at least at first blush it seems to be, because everybody observes with their own eyes that the sun rises every day and it sets every day. In other words, it begins here, it moves around, and it goes down. right? So it's going around us. So, and are you moving? No, you're not moving. You're standing still. Does it feel like you're moving? Only if the earth quakes, right? Then you're moving. But in general, you're standing still. And everything else, the planets are moving around you. You can see the moon do it, you can see the sun move it, and you can actually see some of the other planets. There are certain times of the year when you can see some of the other constellations in the skies, right? And so this fits that model. By the way, this is not the only view in the ancient world. There was another one held by another astronomer by the name of Aristarchus who held this view, the Copernican view, because he observed other things. But this was the dominant view, and it was the one that the church endorsed in the end, which was decisive for the medieval period, right? In the ancient world, so there were competing theories. This is the one, this is a better explanation for reality. That's what a theory is. It's a way of explaining what we can observe. And it has to account for all of the contradictions that we see, etc. And this was it. So with this in mind, then other things would be associated with it. But let's just look at the constellation itself. We have the lunae, the moon, right, from which we get the word luna and lunacy. Mercury, Venus, Solus or the sun, Martis or Mars, Jovis, Jupiter, Saturn, and then we get outside those the spheres, the 8th, the 9th, and the 10th heavens. And then outside of all that, we get the kingdom of heaven, or the empire of heaven. So heaven is outside of that cosmology. They understand that you can't place God in a place per se, because he's outside space and time. When you conceive of where God is, and you are going to say to a child, well, he's a spiritual being, we can't see him, it still doesn't contradict our sense that a spiritual being is still in some sense just invisible, but has a place, right? It's just like an invisible man. He's there, I just can't see him, but there's a place where that man is. They're not so silly as we are on this front. He's not in the created universe. It's not just he's invisible. He's not there to be associated with that. In some sense, he's outside of it. At the same time, and this is what is difficult to understand, God is present at all times. So that is hard to put those two thoughts together. How is that possible? Right? He's not, you get what I mean. For them, they place God outside of that then. Or up. He's up. And if you want to look to Scripture for it, when Jesus ascends, after being raised, 40 days later, he ascends to the Father's right hand, he goes up in the air. Right? He goes, what does that mean? I mean, is it like I don't know, got a jet pack on and he flies up into the air? Hard to visualize, but it's just, you take it as it is. And what does that mean? Well, he goes up to heaven. Well, then heaven's up, right? So they're taking that quite literally. Okay, up, but it can't be up as in at the top of something, looking down from a great height. Although in Scripture it talks about God looking down from a great height, like in the Tower of Babel. There's that image, right? God stooped down. They build this tower as high as they could possibly do to reach the heavens themselves. That's their aim, and God has to stoop down and really squint because it's so low. I mean, it's humorous. It's intentionally humorous. But he is not within that, and so the medievals place him outside of this whole system. But actually, they have another problem with their view, and they're doing something with Scripture in this view. They conceive of heaven as a city. Look at Revelation, the heavenly Jerusalem. And they present it as a city that's going to come down, right? It's going to come down from God. They're visualizing this, while not being so naive as to really associate it with those things. They still, you have to look, we think in space-time fashion. We can't help but do it. We're trying to conceptualize for ourselves something that really can't be conceptualized because it evades our categories. But still, it's up there. And if the city is up there, and that is a city, and we're not in the city, then we're outside the city. We're outside the city. So when we look up, we don't look out. When we look up, we look in from the outside. We're outside looking towards the inside when we look up. We look up and we look in. Now I say this is relevant because when you come to Narnia, this is what Aslan says to the children, come on. Further up, further in. Right? In the last battle. They're to move in to the city that they're currently outside of. Why are they outside the city? Well, because they're rebels. That's the kingdom of God. They are to pray that God's kingdom would come on earth as it is in heaven, but it's not there yet, and we're outside. We're on a journey to that place, to the city, and we're not yet in it. Now, the reason that seems odd to us is because we operate under the idea of the heavens being a void place, and when we look up, we also look out, and we call it outer space. And with the word space, we have connotations of absence. And so when you think about God up there, which we're happy enough to do, we also think of him as way out there. Not way out as in the sense of crazy, but way out in the sense of he is beyond. And to some extent, that means we're on the inside, and he's on the outside, which makes us real and him less real. He's insubstantial, he's spiritual, he's out there where nothing is. And he himself is nothing. I don't think intellectually people really intend it quite this vulgarly, but actually I do think conceptions of in and out and up and down have a strong affect on people in the way they visualize God. So it's very easy with that view, that is, this view of the Copernican revolution, to conceive of God as nothing. So the beginnings of nihilism are there in the cosmology. They aren't actually in the cosmology. You can hold to this cosmology and still believe that God exists. But just in terms of, since we associate everything in spatial-temporal terms, it's very hard for us to visualize what Scripture says about God, which is that he is the most real thing of all things. He is chavod. He is heavy. And we are hevel. We are vanity. We're like a puff of wind. There's nothing there. We are nothing. He's everything. We are insubstantial. He is substantial. He is the being of all other beings. He grounds all being. He's the essence of being, which is how medieval philosophy presents it in Aquinas' philosophy, for instance, right? He's the ground of all being. When Moses asks God who he is, he says, who shall I say sent me? And he says, I am that I am. Or, I will be what I will be. But it's a sort of a cryptic response and takes some teasing out. Well, Aquinas takes it as an assertion of God's being, which we cannot name. It's the ground of all other naming. He names us. He has being, we don't. He, as creator, authors everything else, names it, etc. But our being derives from him. He's the source of being. Makes perfect sense. But if you flip it around, then it's the opposite. He's the absence of being. And it's out there. Now, Lewis is going to address this in his fictional, in the sci-fi trilogy. He's going to confront modern science fiction, which always posits space in terms of a void, an absence, a nothingness, a darkness. And terrifying at that. And he quotes Pascal here, I think, and I don't know where this is in terms of page numbers here. I might be able to find it. I don't know if I can now. But he says the eternity and of the infinite spaces terrifies me. So he is the first person on record. This is Pascal, the French Calvinist or the Huguenot, observes when he looks up, he's an agoraphobe. He's afraid of the empty spaces. Agoraphobia is a modern phenomenon. There's no evidence in the ancient world or in the medieval world or even probably in the Renaissance world of anyone being afraid of going out in the open spaces. The agora, by the way, is the marketplace. It's where there's no roof. You go out, that's what the agora is in Greek. And it's the fear of being outside. Why are you afraid? Because there's nothing above you. And people find that terrifying. In the same way some people find being cramped in a small space terrifying, I'm terrified by the immensity. Very modern experience. Why wouldn't these people experience that? Because they perceive this as a great presence, not as a great absence. And they see the greatest presence above them and is assuring themselves of a relation to them. This is a relational model, by the way. The planets all relate to the Earth. Everything relates to everything else, by the way. It's a relational model. It's not just that we have a relationship with God, which every Christian asserts, a personal relationship with Jesus. It's a phrase. It's also accurate, but it's also misleading. They have a personal relationship with everything, because everything relates to everything else. Whereas we tend to think of relationships as something that we establish. I didn't have a relationship with you until I established that relationship. That's not the way any medieval would ever see it. You are related to me by virtue of the fact that you exist. We don't think we have a relationship until we initiate it. And before that, there was no relationship. I just met you. So, it's just, no medievalist would ever think this way. Of course, all things relate to each other. And they relate to each other because, of course, one, they're all created by God, of course. And in that sense, they relate that way. But they even relate without that mediation, as it were, because everything around us relates to us, and we are related to those things. And it works by means of what they call influence. By the way, do you know where the word flu comes from? He talks about it here in this little chapter. It's an Italian word, influenza, which just means they have no idea. It's from something in relation, in a relational flux here. But see, Saturn has an effect on Jupiter and Mars and the Sun and Venus and Mercury and the Moon, and they're all moving. By the way, these spheres are all moving. You ever heard about, like, if you sing old hymns, it talks about the moving of the spheres? It's referring to this cosmology. It's preserved in hymnody of the 18th, even the 19th century. It's there in the hymns, right? And we've sort of lost the rolling of the spheres. This sphere, so I'm not going to write on this because somebody won't be very happy with me, but there would be an arrow going in this direction and one going down that way. Sometimes I've done this up and then just done it on the whiteboard, but you get it. One sphere is going this way, the other sphere is going against it. And the movement of those spheres creates a sort of oscillation. I have no idea who this is. A name I don't recognize either. It creates a music, a celestial music, a music that you cannot hear, but which accords with our musical scale. The heavenly music corresponds to the musical scale. Music is one of the 7 liberal arts. Specifically, it's a liberal art, I'm going to talk more about this next class, that relates to arithmetic with number. There's a frequency to it. You can study it mathematically. There's a mathematical precision to this particular note. They observe this. Mathematics is integrally related to music, and music is integrally related to astronomy. And it's also related to geometry. Those are the 4 subjects of the quadrivium. And so what is it talking about, the quadrivium? It's talking about everything on Earth, things that we hear, things that we measure and things that we can't even see. Arithmetic, we can't see number. There is no such thing as number. It's an abstract concept. It's a sense of proportion, etc. It enumerates something, right? And geometry is measuring the earth. Astronomy is measuring it's the law of the heavens. All of those things are interrelated. By the way, though, so I mentioned the 3 or the 4 subjects of the quadrivium. There's also 3 of the trivium: grammar, logic, rhetoric. I'll talk about that next time when we talk about the 7 liberal arts, but they're all connected with this. And this gets overthrown by a new theory that we associate with Nicholas Copernicus, or more famously with Galileo Galilei, who has the telescope. He looks up to the heavens and he sees that around Jupiter, Jovis, there are 4 moons. The 4 moons he couldn't see without the telescope. They don't go around the Earth, they go around Jupiter. So they don't follow this system. They don't all revolve around the Earth. They revolve around something completely different. They also see there's a great comet that goes across the sky. Seems to break this idea of perfection and fixity and so forth. They can explain it, but still it causes great conundrum with this model, which is presumed to be scientifically accurate. And it is scientifically accurate. When I say that, I mean science in the sense of knowledge, because that's what the Latin word scientia means. It fits their whole system of knowledge. It fits music. It fits mathematics, arithmetic. It fits with geometry. It fits with astronomy, and the elements of the trivium can reflect all that. So the whole system of science, that is knowledge, is connected with this. And so when it breaks, and now it doesn't just break as in here's another theory. Copernicus comes along with a theory, and everyone says, okay, that's an interesting theory, that's fine. As I say, Aristarchus held that theory at one point, and we said that, yeah, this is a better way of looking at it. But Galileo, with a telescope, says, no, this isn't just a theory, this is the way it is. Your theory is rot. It does not explain what's going on. And he does it with a telescope. So I make a great deal of this in my book about the fact that a technological implement is used to overthrow a whole way of knowing. And there's a trust that's placed in technology that is basically magical, a belief that power comes through technology to see things more clearly than knowledge previously could have held. There's a great deal of interest in technology. I don't know if I'm right on this, but I see a tendency there. And it has some explanatory power. And it certainly reflects something we see in Lewis and Tolkien, which is a great deal of power connected with technological means, like a ring of power. Right? You got to forge the ring. And what does the ring do? Well, one of the things it does, we'll get to this later, is it extends the life of those that put it on. Their life gets extended. It also renders them invisible in the case of the great rings. It also gives them sort of a power over other people. They control their own life. It's in Tolkien, and I think in Lewis, there's something about modern science that is dehumanizing and at the same time very attractive, and he talked about that in The Abolition of Man, right? The last lecture where we talked about actually about the abolition of man. What does modern science do? Well, it offers the opportunity of gaining power over nature. We've got nature whooped, right? And yet he observes that actually we never manage to do that. We end up delivering power to the scientists who promise to deliver us from the human condition and actually only deliver us over into their hands to do experiments on us that they would never do on themselves, like Frankenstein does with the body of the creature. And then they're horrified at what they do after the fact. So there's an element of they're attracted to it, and at the same time they're repulsed by the very thing that they've just done. It's like a cautionary tale told over and over and over. And they're surprised at the outcome of it sometimes, or at least some are. So this view, okay, so the music of the spheres comes from the oscillation of the planets, the vibration, And the effect of this music going down to the earth is influence. And so the constellation of the planets, depending on where they are in the sky, will betoken certain things and will have certain effects. And they can readily observe this because the moon, they see, affects the tides. They rise and fall, depending on the cycle of the moon. If you lived out in Newfoundland, in the Bay of Fundy, you would see it. I mean, it literally goes up tens of feet, 20 feet, I don't know, but a huge distance in relation to the moon. So it is pulling things up. Obvious, visible sign of influence. There are invisible signs of influence. They want to determine everything in accordance with this. And so there's an element in the medieval mind, not of an anti-scientific view, but almost a determinism about it. Because since everything influences everything else, you can explain everything as an effect of a cause, in which case you have no free will. Right? But it's a highly rationalistic system. It's not the way the Enlightenment presents it, that it's anti-rational. It's almost the opposite. There's no room for chance in this, per se, or very little. Because everything is influenced. It's caused. And it's caused by the primum mobile, the prime mover on the outside that's turning everything around. In some portraits of this, we will see a hand coming down with, I have it in my Shakespeare book. There's a hand going down, and it's got the tetragrammaton, Jehovah, and he's turning the spheres from the outside. And in other words, this is how God's providence works. It's not only through the creation of the universe, he's also involved in orchestrating what happens. So there's no blind chance. God ordains all things in accordance with his good and perfect will. And that includes on the righteous and the unrighteous. Everyone is affected by this. It fits the biblical view. It fits the way they see things, and it's all integrated. So Lewis comments, and again, I don't know what page it is, but I know this well enough. When the medieval looked up at the night sky at heaven, he didn't see what we see. He never saw outer space. He looked as if he were looking up at the base of the CN Tower. Not his illustration, that's mine. Obvious. But a great edifice, a huge building, the enormity of it. He was in awe of how great the heavens were, but he had a decided sense that they were above him and far greater than he. He was small, they were great. He felt awe at the night sky. He also felt a sense of presence greater than his. He never felt afraid of being alone, because loneliness is again a modern phenomenon caused by this cosmology and the spatial-temporal consequences of it. Most people can't think in the abstractions of cosmology. They don't even bother with it, but they do think in terms of physical senses. I think this has an imaginative effect that we've never got over. But it also causes the desacralization of the cosmos. You can read about the fact that the heavens declare the glory of God, and the skies showeth forth the work of his hands. You can read in Romans 1 where Paul talks about even the pagans know that there is a creator God by virtue of the fact that things have been made the way they've been made. They observe from consequences. It's a direct effect. No problem with that. If you break that sense of cause and effect associations or influence all over the face, you break that, then you get disconnected, erratic, uncaused events. Random, meaningless, purposeless, without any love whatsoever. It's power, but not love. So the Christian assurance that God is love, people like that, actually. But it doesn't have a lot of affect on them. They don't feel that, because it is something that love is something we initiate. It's not something that surrounds us. It's not something that's a part of everything. The medieval would always think that love was all around him at all times. And from the analogy of love, and we'll look at this when we go to the four loves. I'll come to that later on the course. When we come to the four loves, he will make analogies between the things closest to him, familiar love, which he calls storge, to the things that are willful associations, friendship, and go a little bit further out to eros, romantic love, and then above all of those, agape love, which is the love of God, which is all the lower loves and the closer loves are an analogy of that, and yet they are a pale shadow of what that is. This defines the other rather than the other way around. So when Lewis writes about love, and love is the keynote of Lewis's work, I think, he is not just talking like an Augustinian, which it is. Paul is the apostle of love. Or is it John? Or is it Jesus? Who knows? It's there throughout Scripture. God is love. St. Augustine has been associated with love as the centerpiece of his theology, and it's there for Lewis. It's all over the place. So we're going to keep coming upon this word love. Remember, when he's talking about love, he's also trying to contrast what happens when we lose a sense of love permeating all things. We're supposed to love God with our minds. How is that possible if our minds conceive of God as an absence? Can't love nothing. Love is relational. Right? So you see the shift and why it's important. And here he's not saying, he's not speculating. He goes to the sources and shows you this is how they saw things. This is why it's a valuable exercise. He's helping us see the world the way they would have seen it. And we would never have imagined that it was like this unless he did that, or unless we were a fellow medievalist who were so immersed in the subject that we also would see things that way. And so Lewis almost illustrates what he repeatedly deplores, which is the chronological snobbery of our day. By which he means we assume that the way we look at things is the best, and that everything before us was backward, redundant, or obsolete, or superstitious, like those medievals, right? He says, no, this is rational, effective, meaningful, and in some ways, purposive. What he says at the end of the book, I'll come to this next class, is that he doesn't want to go back to this cosmology. He's not saying that the old cosmology is correct. He is saying that there is a important influence from it which we must not ignore, and if we hold it in our mind's eye, I am convinced by this, it actually helps us to understand things. The cosmology might be gone, but everything associated with it is not, including the musical scales and its connection with arithmetic. But there's a new way of doing geometry thereafter, a new way of doing astronomy. There's even a new way of doing arithmetic. And it more and more fits the Copernican revolution. Whether it helps us by doing so, that's a subject of debate. What I have said is that when it comes to the study of the humanities, it impedes us. When we study human beings as if they were an object of study, we do something that's radically dehumanizing. It's the view from nowhere, as if we were looking down and we weren't people looking at other people. We are like the scientist looking through a telescope or a, microscope at that little thing down there, of which we are not. And we're objective because we can see it and we are measuring it with our mathematical precision, and these days with AI and all of the other computer technology, and we can come to a better understanding of human nature because we're using science. So he's making us question what we mean by science, because remember, what I've just presented to you here is science. It's a type of knowledge. It's an integrated type of knowledge. It's a relational type of knowledge. It's a human type of knowledge. Any comments or questions? I wanted to give you, I threw it really quick, really hard, all at once, right? Because I think it's helpful to get it that way. It has to be awesome. It is awesome. It's a transformative way of looking at things. It's consistent with his writing, his literature. When we come to Narnia, you will see. When you read the sci-fi trilogy, you will see. When we come to his greatest literary work, Till We Have Faces, you will see it, because it's a story about love and about seeing and faces. The face of God is not evident in this portrait because there's nothing there. He's up there and he's out there, and, well, there's nothing up there or out there. Whereas if you look up and see that there is an immensity above you, and God is at the height of that immensity, and not only do you relate to him, but you are, and at present you are outside of, but one day you will be inside of, and you will be so near to the ground of all being that there will no longer be anything that impedes that. It's a breathtaking implication. By the way, in this cosmology, I should say that everything beneath the sun is affected by the fall. So the reason we can't hear the music of the spheres is because of the fall. If it had not been for the fall, this is conjecture, we would hear the music of the spheres, but because of that, everything that falls beneath the sun is affected by change. These are the immutable spheres outside the sun. Perfect, concentric. Beneath it, we find that the world is marked by the fall, which means things change. There's seeming randomness. The world is marked by mutability, imperfection, even contradiction. Outside of that, no, but because of the fall, everything's changed. So what changes? Well, the moon. It changes its cycles. In fact, the moon is associated with change, mutability, and the effect of that is lunacy. Right? You're under the influence of the moon. In Romeo and Juliet, Romeo swears his love for Juliet. He swears by the moon. She says, swear not by the moon, swear rather by the sun. Right? Because it doesn't change, whereas the moon, well, that changes all the time. I want you to swear eternal love to me, not that you're going to, okay, I like you now, but tomorrow at the end of the month, that's it for you. Right? And so she's making fun, right? That's part of the jest. But also, they're called star-crossed lovers. Same work. And it just happened at the wrong time. It has an explanatory value for human history. Remember that the coming of Christ was seen in the heavens by the wise men. There was actually a constellation that betokened something was going to happen that had never happened before. They knew it. They saw it on their charts of the heavens, which had a historical record, but also then they went to Holy Scripture to say, okay, but let's have some more specifics there. Well, the Hebrews say that in Bethlehem. That's where the Messiah will come. We got to go there. Where is it? That way. I don't know. We go. They end up in the wrong place. End up in Jerusalem. They meet Herod. And they're saying, yeah, okay, well then when you go there, tell me what you find. Right? And they never come back. And they arrive 6 months late. Such is the wisdom of this world. But they did get the stars right? It did happen. Very interesting. And there are records of this unique cosmic event happening, by the way, as well. Any comments or questions here? I'm not going to go into the specifics here, but you can associate all sorts of things with the planets as well. And Lewis talks about them. So on page 105, he talks about Saturn, about Jupiter, about Mars, about the Sol, the Sun, about Venus, about Mercury. These are associated with gods. They have certain other associations as well. They're associated with metals. They're associated with certain professions. They are associated with certain characteristics, psychological characteristics, we would say. So somebody born under the influence of Jupiter is going to be a certain disposition. It's a way of explaining psychology. Also explaining psychology will be the combination of the four elements that they will see here: earth, air, fire, and water. The combination of these will create what they call humors. It's a biochemical, although they don't have a sense of biochemistry, it's a physiological, material way of explaining what we call psychological profiles. Why are people, who are all people, all bear the image of God, yet so different in their temperaments? Is there one temperament which is supposed to be normative? Modern psychology says yes. And so it's going to give you a drug to drug you so that you're not so depressed. It's going to drug you so that you're not too excitable or anxious or whatever, because it doesn't see the difference as a good thing. It wants to make a normative psychology. Now, the ancient world sees with psychology that there is such a thing as a balanced personality, yes, and we should seek to achieve it by means of virtue. However, every person will, in accordance with their own makeup, incline to one thing and not be able to meet that norm. And it's wrong to try and impose it on everybody to make everybody happy all the time, give you a happy pill. That's a sort of use of science as magic to create a certain outcome, which is equality. And equality is inhumane. It has a leveling effect, a flattening effect. The modern discipline of psychology does not exist in the ancient world. It's certainly not as a science. But they have a quasi-scientific explanation for it. And so if you are ill, they'll do, among other things, they'll bleed you. Or they'll leech you, they'll stick a leech on you or whatever. Like, ugh. You don't want to get sick in the ancient world, right? But they say you've got too much blood in you. And that's why you're flushed and you have a fever. Got to cool that person down. Well, how am I going to cool that person down? Well, let a little bit of the blood out, which is not what you want when you have a fever, right? And usually the patient dies, and you think, don't call for the physician. Nope, thank you. But there's a temperament. So those under the influence of Mars have a martial temperament. In other words, they're fighters. Venus, or Aphrodite, the lady of Cyprus, creates mortals that are amorous, so forth. And nations are affected by this. The people of Venus are the Romans, believe it or not. They're not they're not born under the influence of the god of war. They're born under the influence of the god of love, the goddess of love. This is why Virgil, their great epic poet, says that they can never achieve an eternal kingdom because they're prone to all of the dangers that come with amorousness. They're not constant. He wants them to be constant. If they're born under the reign of Jupiter, maybe. Certain temperament there. The Roman people are too hot-headed, too passionate, too whatever, right? This isn't going to work. Too inconstant. So it has explanatory power. Whatever you make of it, it's interesting. And what it is not is it's not irrational. There is a reason for everything, in everything, and everything relates to everything else. As I say, fascinating, huh? Yes?
This is really similar to, well, not too similar, but to modern astrology. Is this right?
So astrology is there in the ancient world as well, although it becomes very influential, not in the medieval period, but in the Elizabethan period. Alongside the rise of magic, a rise in interest in astrology and in desire to see determinism in all things. The medieval knows better. They may have influence, but they do not determine. There's a choice in these things. Elizabeth would probably regard this likewise, I presume. But the danger of astrology, they're not saying that the heavens don't influence things. Or the case against astrology is not that there is an influence of the planets, it's that it determines outcomes, so you have no part to play in it. So you read your horoscope for today, and it says you're going to meet someone special or something, and it's like, if you read each one, each one could apply to you every day. It's quackery for almost always. But what do you do when you go to an astrologist? You're trying to gain power over your future. Act in accordance with it. That's not what they're doing here. So it's not forbidden, but it's strongly cautioned against. As if it were, as I say, determinism happened from this. Now, Lewis comments this. He says, cosmology plays so small a part in all the spiritual writers that he can think of. A very small part. And it isn't effused with any high religious ardor in any writer I know except Dante. But Dante is the most influential of them all. So this is the problem. But in the medieval period in general, nobody ascribes too much spiritual significance to this. Dante does. So that's interesting. He adds, the danger to monotheism in the Middle Ages does not come from the cult of angels, because with every planet there's an angel associated as well, by the way. The 8 orders of the angels, whatever, they're also associated with the musical notes. He says, but this wasn't the danger of polytheism. There's no danger of that. The bigger danger, he says, is from the cult of the saints. But thrones, dominions, powers, angels, archangels, cherubim, seraphim, etc. These are the 8 orders of the angels. Let me move to the longevity. I have a little more than 10 minutes here. These are the long livers. He wants to talk about something that Tolkien talks at great length about, which is the realm of the fairies. He takes the name of longevity from Marcianus Capella, who mentions dancing companies on the longevity who haunt the woods, the glades, and groves, and lakes, and springs, and brooks, whose names are Pans, Fauns, Satyrs, Sylvans, Nymphs, all of which we find in Lewis's fiction. Right? They're all there. These are long-lived creatures. What are they? Well, we'll come to that question at the end. He's going to give 4 possible explanations for them. There is no consensus on them, by the way. They're different portraits. Let's talk about fairies themselves, because he thinks that we could call them all by the name of fairies. But he says the problem with the word fairy is all the connotations that come with it. By the way, Tolkien writes a work which we'll read next semester in Sci-Fi Subcreation on fairies and fairy stories. And he's going to do there what Lewis does here as well. But Lewis does it in a bit more of a scholarly fashion, I think, although Tolkien's essay is more famous, because Tolkien is more interested in things like elves and dwarfs and so forth, right? But Lewis gives us sources here and says there are 3 ways of looking at fairies, and a good way is to look at a passage from Milton. So let me see if I can find this in this online. I'll put it in front of you if I can get to it quickly. Nope, that was it. Is this it? No, it's not. I knew it. There it is. There it is. 3 passages from Milton. Can you read that? I'll do it one bigger. You can cite the passages yourself and write them down and go to them afterwards if you want. 3 passages, all of which cite fairies, but talk about a different type of fairy. That's more or less what he's going to say. And 3 sort of impressions of what a fairy is. The first one is from Comus, which is a courtly masque. It's a wedding pantomime. And it says, no evil thing that walks by night in fog or fire, by lake or moorish fen, blue meagre hag or stubborn unlaid ghost, no goblin or swart fairy of the mine. Swart means black. From the like German word schwarz, swart, Old English word. Second illustration, little mini fairies like Peter Pan, like the miniature, that sort of thing. That's the second reference. Like that Pygmean race beyond the Indian Mount, or fairy elves, whose midnight revels by a forest side or mountain some belated peasant sees. That's from Paradise Lost, book 1, line 70, 780 and following. And then thirdly, from Paradise Regained, and ladies of the Hesperides that seemed fairer than feigned of old, or fabled since of fairy damsels met in forest wide of knights of Logres or of Leon. Logres, by the way, is Camelot, King Arthur's kingdom. That's what Logres is. It's another poetic word for it. So, 3 references to fairies from Milton. He says each one of these references is sort of distinct, has different connotations. And so the idea of fairy, which is very common in medieval and Renaissance literature, has greater associations than the one that we have reduced it to, which is this one. Little, sprightly, invisible Tinkerbells. What's the first association? Well, the swart fairy is classified among horrors. You better be afraid. This is something terrifying. He said this is just one strand in the tradition. Beowulf, which some of you will have read, ranks the elves among the Ettins and giants as the enemies of God. Now, if you read The Silver Chair, he talks about Ettin, right? He uses the word Ettin. This is a giant. And no, they are the enemies of God. He's getting this directly from Beowulf. If you haven't read Beowulf and you just hear the word, you think, well, it's just a word he's made up. No, he is associating it. And in our mind, if we were medievalists, we would know immediately the association of hostility to God as well. So these are enemies of God. So in the Ballad of Isabel and the Elf Knight is a kind of Bluebeard. In Gower, the Slander of Constance says that she is of fairy because she has given birth to a monster. So this is a sort of giant, terrifying, hostile entity. This is fairy. Does anyone ever think of a fairy this way? Or an elf this way? But this is one of the understandings of elves. Tolkien's sense of elves has this sense not of a monster, but of something superhuman, powerful, long-lived. In the case of Tolkien, immortal. Right? They don't die of their own accord. You can kill them, but they're not going to die because of any natural infirmity. So there, and then he asked the question, so why not nymphs? He says nymphs wouldn't have solved the problem, but nymphs are also terrifying to our ancestors. You don't think that because you think of nymphs as desirable females hanging around the woods and the trees and so forth that the gods tend to have interesting relationships with. Those are the nymphs. But he says if you read the medieval sources, these are often monstrous creatures like a lamia. They seduce you. They take possession of your soul. They're not positive. You even get that in Odysseus. Calypso is female. He has relations with her. We assume that she's like a female, but an immortal female and really beautiful. Well, that's okay. Except that he is desperate to get away from her. She's possessed him. It's something of that sort. So it's a dark view. And he says that it gains ground in the 16th and 17th century, for which reason fairy now veers into the direction of witch. Not there earlier, but now come the Renaissance, this type of dark fairy gets a lot of traction. Secondly, it's a very different conception. Well, this is a lot more familiar because Shakespeare will employ it. In Midsummer Night's Dream, that sort of thing. Not very threatening. They're like the wee man, pygmies. Smaller than men, and that's about it. Are they just dwarfish, like small? Who knows? But not particularly threatening. They're their size is less important than that they are full of mirth. Milton associates it with this. They have they are on their mirth and dance intent. So they're delightful things. They're like in A Midsummer Night's Dream. Cheerful. The opposite of the other one. Like one's big and terrifying and opposed to God's will. The other is the opposite. Think of A Midsummer Night's Dream. That's probably what you know best. The third, with the fairy damsels met in Forest Wide, is the most important for medievalists, he says, and it's less familiar to the modern imagination. And he says, and it demands the most difficult response. So they are met in Forest Wide, and the word met is the most important word. It's not accidental. The fairies choose to make themselves known to someone. They have come to find us, and their intentions are usually not always amorous. They are the fays of French romance, the fays of our own, the fate of the Italians. And Morgan Le Fay, or Bercelac in Gawain, is called an elvish man. He's of this kind. Morgan Le Fay, often humanized, is full fairy. There's something amorous about her, but there's also something that is rather magical, threatening, but not opposed to God necessarily. Not necessarily. And then he goes on to talk about these characteristics that don't entirely fit. One, they are very material, very real. They are so real that they jump off the page. Think of Bercelac, the Green Knight. He is green. He is the definition of greenness. He's enormous. He's huge. He's powerful. On the other hand, they seem to have an insubstantial quality. These two things don't mix, but that's there with the fairies. So they're very physical, and at the same time, they're very much spiritual, and they are elusive. We can't get them. They get us. Okay, I'm running out of time here. So think of Bercelac in Sir Gawain the Green Knight. This is a fairy of that sort. I'll give you the four theories at the start of next class. I'll give you his take on it, and then I'll move on to the rest of the book. Okay? But we'll leave it off for now. Thank you.